For your presentation. First of all, I'll just say that we do have a few questions which we will ask you, and we will try to make it quite thematic, so that we trying to discuss a question through with you before we move on to the next one. Just trying not to ask in east and west, but of course we can only control what we can control. But I really do want to say, I'm pretty sure I'm talking on behalf of the group here, that you made a really good presentation now. You're a very convincing presentation. Very happy with that. And I also would like to say that your thesis is very good, and we really enjoyed reading your thesis. And in that sense, it's only positive that we have questions. I mean, that's because we have read your thesis and we thought that's something we really would like to discuss with you. So, and before I get to my first questions, then that your whole idea of discussing future generation and equity and these type of issues in your thesis have been really interesting and really eye-opening for all of us, and I'm sure for everyone who's reading your papers. So I'll get to my first question, and that's related to your idea of moving to the multi-criteria analysis, going from the CBA, from the cost-benefit analysis. I'm a bit surprised that in none of your papers that you really show it directly. What is the difference? Like say, well, if you've done a CBA on this bridge in Frederikshavn or the high-speed train in UK, that say, okay, well, these are the results of the CBA, and these are the results of my analysis, and then compare them so that the reader could then say, okay, well, then now I can see it's really really good. I can see the difference now. I know that in your third paper on page 22 that you are trying to illustrate it there, but I just thought that even pinning it out even more would be helpful. So why haven't you done that? Do you understand what my question?
Yeah. Well, let's just say up front, maybe I'm not necessarily religious about MCA or CBA. I think that there's just different ways of measuring or achieving kind of the same goals. Maybe truthfully, one starting point is that I'm not an economist and I'm not an expert in cost-benefit analysis. And there's plenty of people already researching on how to then monetize the more difficult aspects of sustainability with CBA. And I'm not the right one necessarily to judge whether that would be eventually successful or not. I just know that there's a lot of work being done around that. For example, agglomeration effect is one of the typical impacts that we're trying to put a handle on, also in this department for cost-benefit analysis. I think I just generally followed from the, well, there's maybe two reasons for focusing more on MCA, on MCA rather than CBA, and then I'll explain why not comparing the two. But it's basically on my own reading of the literature, it really did seem that multi-criteria analysis offered more pathways for the kind of things that I wanted to do. So in a way, my point was to then how to try to embed sustainability in this tool. Maybe it doesn't work actually, and maybe we need something else, a fourth generation, I don't know. But it did seem more promising, and in fact, well, that kind of came from, there's also a kind of tradition in our department for this kind of MCA-based research with an analytical hierarchy process and with generally this range of complex systems tools. And that's really kind of how it started. There are papers, and actually one of my colleagues here, Michael Barford, has done this kind of comparison. In fact, has done even merging the two. So then we could also decide, for example, to use cost-benefit analysis for those impacts that we know can more easily be monetized, let's say, or are clearly private goods. So it makes sense to have in a cost-benefit analysis. And then how do we look at then merging that with an output from multi-criteria analysis, and then have those two merged together in a kind of an overall assessment. I haven't looked at that. I really just looked at, how to implement this stronger sustainability perspective in multi-criteria analysis.
But the reason why I'm asking is because it's relatively easy to refer to the CBA as saying, okay, well, that came out with this result, and then when I did the MCA, then I came up with another result, and then it's just that as a reader, maybe you would like to have a little bit more background to really understand exactly why that was the case. So,
maybe we can ask it like this. Do you think if you would use a CBA on this same problem, would you have another type of recommendation?
Well, probably, and I think that's where it's the interesting thing, because if we just take a step back, again, it doesn't really matter which tool we're using, but if the tools give different results, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
That's the part that we should look at. That's why I would say, we should ensure, let's say, that we use these different type of tools. I guess this goes back to this idea of complexity theory or complex systems. That one way to address complexity is to take to use multiple approaches to address it, and so, right, so if CBA says we should go this way and MCA says we should go this way, it's a little bit like what I showed with multi-criteria analysis, that we have different perspectives. The point is these represent then different perspectives. Maybe the key is that we need to understand, I mean, I see these things quite often on the internet, right? Okay, it's 10 times more expensive per kilometer to society to drive a car than to cycle a bicycle, for example. And then that's kind of put out there as a fact because it was calculated based on some kind of cost-benefit analysis. But then you need to look at what is in there, right? Is it the 28 criteria here that I claim are somewhat comprehensive, or is it just 5 of those? And typically it's just a really subset. So, I mean, of course, we researchers would be looking at behind the scene what is actually included in that, and that would help us understand then what perspective one tool represent and what perspective another tool represent. Distilling that to.
But I think when you did in your presentation, you added some graphics on top of your figure at page 22, right? So you added some graphic there. You said, okay, well, this is probably this is most economic oriented, and this is probably related to the CBA, and the other one are related to the MCA. So so that was what you did when you did the presentation here, and I'm just thinking, well, I mean, that was pretty convincing, but that showed to me that it is two very different approaches, and you're not mixing them. So you have one, which is the CBA, and the other one is the MCA.
Yeah. Well, just to clarify one thing on what I showed in this slide. I don't know if I should show it again, but is that the goals or the impacts that perform well for HS2, which also were part of the CBA in the assessment. they were very closely related to the official goals of HS2, and in that sense, everything sort of made sense that HS2 is then prioritized because that's the goals that they wanted, and if we look at the criteria under that, then it performs well and everything is fine. Kind of.
Okay, no, we'll leave that for now. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Yannick, I also enjoyed reading your PhD. I think you brought a lot of interesting concepts into it, and sometimes I had some questions on, but make it now concrete. So, but there are many good ideas in it. So my first question is about the MAMCA, of course, and I'm very happy that you used the methodology. This morning I explained how we typically use it, and we first look at what are the stakeholders. And in your article 3, I have the impression that you just talked with a lot of transport experts, and then in the end you classify them in 4 groups, saying these are different stakeholder groups, but it's a bit the other way around then. So can you explain why you didn't look at who has a stake, what are stakeholder groups, and did it like this?
That's I admit that this is a difficult problem, this issue of stakeholders, because at some point when I was looking at this, I was thinking there seems to be as many stakeholders as there are people. Really, how do you group stakeholders, right? I mean, originally the idea, just from the starting point, was, okay, let's interview government people, let's interview, well, it was pretty much like that, huh? Let's interview transport experts, let's interview sustainability experts, let's interview the public or NGOs, the public represented by NGOs. So, but then the whole practicality. So, for example, interviewing the public or getting really deep into the stakeholders impacted by that. That's a real that's a project in itself, really. So going through the NGOs was a kind of easier way, but the key was really to look at transport experts or those transport practitioners in these that know about HS2. So,
but you went even a step further because you also let them evaluate the different options.
Correct.
And for that, you said, there is a whole pile of studies being done. Why not using those studies? I guess there is so much information on what's the impact on CO2, on local emissions. Yeah. Because you bring in kind of subjectivity. Certainly if you then say, well, they're experts, but they are also stakeholders.
Okay. Ooh, there's a lot to say about this, but well, the alternative, or the standard AHP way would be to, if we go with AHP, not cost-benefit analysis, let's say, would be to, as you say, look at the documentation and then for each criteria do the objective assessment kind of by myself, really, right? To have a truly objective, but I don't agree that it's that truly objective. The point is that I'm not sure if any kind of transport expert looking at the case of HS2 can make a... The key point is that I sort of believe that putting some democracy in that would make a better overall assessment. So let's remember that the idea here for the assessment part, so this on page 22 and the graph with all the lines, that's an objective assessment. It's relative, but the idea behind this is that it shouldn't be so contentious to say that HS2 performs better in terms of journey time than upgrade of WCML. And overall, all the people that answered that assessment, there's a kind of average there that there's a kind of bell curve on the result that tells me that, okay, so this is the overall assessment, and I would think that's probably more objective than just me doing that.
Yeah, but
now
it wouldn't be you doing that, it would be you looking at the studies, what has been found in terms of what's the impact on CO2, for example. Because you also let them evaluate all the criteria. For example, there is a criterion on build aesthetics. So,
aesthetics.
Aesthetics. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure if all transport experts are able to say something about it. They can.
Okay. I can clarify a little bit the process. So it's not that all stakeholders answered all impacts, because that would be so many to do. So the assumption that we did is that basically you as a stakeholder choose certain criteria that are important. Okay, 6, 9, whatever number. Then you do a kind of normative ranking preference based on how important and relevant that impact is in this specific case from your perspective. So that's the subjective part of it. And then for the objective assessment, you then also assess only those criteria that you chose. How is the performance of the 3 alternatives, right? Yeah. So the assumption is that because you choose these criteria, you must have some kind of interest in them and must know something about it. So you're probably the best person to be answering that in the first place. Now there might be some motivational bias here, right? Mm-hmm. And that's true. And actually, I could uncover motivational bias with this approach, in fact, because I'll try to explain it. Follow me. So what happens here is that we have 33 respondents who have chosen a random number of criteria that are important, and they have assessed them. Okay, and then all these answers are assumed at first to be objective, so they are all geometrically average. So they're all put together basically to compose this bigger picture of assessment. Some criteria were assessed by 16 people, like carbon footprint, and some were only assessed by 2, prestige and image, for example. So there's a kind of issue here, but the key point is by averaging you get hopefully a better approximation of what the most likely assessment is. But I did see motivational bias, and this happened in this way now, because somebody, for example, I interviewed was really keen on HS2, and in that case, and that was the value of having it as a structured interview, is that I could discuss with that person and I could see, okay, he really wants HS2. So when it was time to do the assessment, well, it was all the way. Right? So if I was doing it, I would know that, well, it's not really true based on the data that we have, but he would put everything all the way. But the key is that then if I compare his own criteria with his own judgments and the final preference that comes out of that, which obviously was 87% HS2 or something like that, and if I instead compare his own preference with the averaged overall assessments, he still preferred HS2, but not by 87%, by 62%. So that was really interesting, because those that were more perhaps less motivated, they would be more aligned. So their judgment would be more average. I don't know if that's a good assumption, but it seemed to me that it's a relevant thing to investigate more. Now, should we exclude his assessment? Maybe somebody else has the opposite motivational. But the point is really and I tried to do it at some point, to create a kind of bell curve to see whether it was a random distribution of answers, whether this assumption that the average is a good one. But basically instead what we did was establish some kind of cutoff. So there's this, and this is very difficult because we're talking about qualitative versus quantitative, right? Which theory should I use? I mean, if we see this as quantitative data, I should have 1,000 respondents, so for this to be valid. But if it's, but anyway, if I base it on I think it's called Guest 2006 is the number of interviews that are necessary before your kind of opinion converge, or before there's no more something that you can get from having an extra interview. So it's pure qualitative data. And they say that after 6 interviews, usually it starts to be not repetitive, but you know, and then up to 12 interviews, you get really more than 12 interviews. You probably won't get much more out of it. That's based on, I think their case is based on interviewing women in African villages. So I mean, you know, but the key point here is that how many people do I need to actually answer this assessment for the assessment to be valid? And we cut it off at 4. It could have been 6, it could have been 12. I mean, the thing is, at some point, if we cut it too high, then you need many more respondents. Okay, so anyway, I hope this explains sort of.
Yeah, it explains a lot. You could have avoided the need of having so many interviews by just looking at, I want that stakeholder group and who is representing that group. And then even you might have one network organization really representing the objectives of that group, and that would be enough. What you want is to know what are they aiming for, and then showing them, well, if you're aiming at this, then this option is the best for you. So it doesn't, you don't really need this kind of representation like you tried. It would be a good way for looking, if you have like the citizens and you want to survey them, then okay, then you need this type of approach. But if you really look at stakeholders, then you wouldn't need that, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks so much for the for your answers, and I'll come back to you.
Okay, thanks Yannick. I think one of the great things about being asked to examine a PhD is it makes you revisit all your own assumptions and your own normative position, particularly in the way that you set out the thesis. So you were very clear about how you were trying to think about and approach the problem. So I found it really stimulating to read. The first question I want to sort of ask you to give a reflection on is about the decision not to address institutional structures or polity, as you said, because clearly your aspiration is for better decision support. And on there's a diagram on page 31 where you separate out the what from the how, and the what is the 3 sustainability principles and how they're operationalised, and the how is the governance process.
Yeah.
So just I'd be interested to know how you came to that decision and what you think, having gone through the process of analysing these various different projects kind of post hoc, what your reflection on that assumption at the start of the process is.
Yeah. Well, I think what I presented somewhat represents also my own kind of evolution mentally. I started perhaps this PhD with a much more, you could say, naive but also instrumental view. Right? Let's make some tools that will fix everything, or something like that. Not that like that, but really. And it's only, well, the first paper was already quite insightful because this utilization function, right? It really has a lot to do about that. So basically, what I can say is that. What do we mean by the organizational side, right? I mean, I think I would still, for now, leave out how transport agency are maybe it's relevant, but it's really too far for me to start looking at how organizational structures, leadership or management structures, and how siloed or not siloed these are, and how that is influencing any kind of agenda on sustainability. That is, for me, I think, I don't have the background really to study that part, I would say. But the politics, definitely, I think that's the obvious path. Henrik has done some work on the use and non-use and misuse and influence and non-influence of indicators, basically. And I think this has all to do with how is then knowledge used. So that's what I was kind of raising in the last slide there is, okay, so on one hand we can improve these tools and make sustainability viewpoints and future generation stakeholders more visible. Will that be enough, actually? I'm still a bit worried about that part. I really cannot say. But I would like to explore that more.
So can I push you a little bit more then? Because I think, in fact, you've started some of the reflection on this. The chart we were just talking about where you showed the 5 objectives that were set for HS2 and how they performed well in the multi-criteria analysis suggests to me that actually what HS2 Limited was doing what it was set up to do. It had an organisational remit and it was operationalising its organisational remit with the scheme that it developed. So we can argue that that's not the best scheme, but you can't tell the person in charge of HS2 that that's not actually the best scheme of the 3 that you looked at, because it actually performs best for the things it was told to do. So for me, I think, and maybe you can give a bit more reflection on this, you talked about framing as being something that these decision support tools can help recreate the debate on what's actually included in assessment. So again, I wonder if there's anything on how this might be used to reframe.
But then I might change my mind a little bit on what I said before. Is I still think there's hope. Okay, how to say this? Because we could question then: would the tools just be used to justify decisions that have already been made, no matter what tools we put? Right. That's kind of the problematic. But I think that's a bit unfair to say that tools are not going to be useful, but they can be useful in many different ways. I have somewhere in the introduction this kind of graph that I made on indicators. It's on page 54 of the introduction, and it's figure 11, but I can also redraw it quickly. But the main point here is that, so in that case, HS2 or the government has policy goals and they set targets, and then they also define the indicators for these targets, and they make an assessment, and the assessment is using these indicators to basically, in a way, justify what it is that they want to build. So you could say whether the indicators or the tools tell the government that they should build HS2, or whether it's them telling you, looking at the tools in the way that it is HS2. Okay, that's kind of a circle. But the point here is that if we do have tools that open up the perspectives, then maybe we cannot break or directly influence what the decision makers will do, but I still think there's the possibility for this kind of indirect use, or this kind of indirect influence, for this kind of framing of of worldviews, and then suddenly it raises perhaps issues of accountability then. So you say that we should build this, but if we look at the result of our different tools now, it's also showing this and that. So from future generations' perspective, maybe we openly don't care about future generations, but still, now there's nobody that's held accountable for the harm we're doing to future generations. So see, if we make this explicit, maybe there would be a chance for influencing the discourse or the this kind of conceptual use of tools, right? So
Yeah, I think your circles there are very helpful in what you are saying. The last circle is the governance, and maybe we need another type of governance that goes along with those new types of methods and tools. Because if, like you say before, a decision maker would just like to be confirmed by the method, or they might even say, I want this, and researchers see that it's coming on like that. But if we really want to go towards a society which is more participatory and more with co-creation possibilities, well, your governance structure should change, and the role the authorities will play should be completely different. It's not hierarchical anymore, but it's more horizontal and more a facilitator's role to know, okay, what are those different stakeholders are having to say about this.
yeah, a bit like this Einstein ladder that you showed in the morning, where the potential of influence from stakeholders changes or increases, let's say, with it. But I don't know if that means new institutions or just a new mindset, or new tools. I mean, it's kind of all part of it, right? I mean, we need the new mindset, the new tools, and yeah.
Thanks. I'll finish that, but I think you have got work still, opportunities still available to you, following on, reflecting on your thesis, to think about how that can be used to reframe what's considered to be knowledge, or how you go about generating options in the first place, before the assessment tools are locked down to the remit of the particular project. So I think there's lots of opportunity for you there.
Yeah, so it's very much connected, because before what you said just before a few minutes ago, my question would have been why you think it is so difficult to incorporate some of these issues into the typical transportation modeling. But what I hear you saying now is that maybe it's not good, or maybe we shouldn't, or maybe we should. But I just say that we would like to have that, or we should be doing it. Where do you see the barriers? Where are the constraints in doing that? Who is? Is there someone who doesn't want to see it? It's maybe a very obvious answer.
You mean, is there an obvious answer? There's probably no obvious answer, but
like if we take some of these certification models also, but transportation models, that they are all looking at trying to get a quite specific answer. They are not really taking multi-criteria or a weighting into account in that assessment of trying to get to a solution. Because it's not part of the modeling.
Well, let me put it this way. I mean, first of all, I don't think there's any kind of conspiracy theory against sustainability. I mean, we are improving, I would say. I think in the feedback that I received, there was this question: Are we better today than we were in the 60s? Or I would guess that we are. I mean, if we look at the appraisal process in the UK, okay, it has its limits, and right, things are going maybe a bit too slow for what the natural science say about the window of opportunity and the urgency that we're facing in terms of changing our consumption and production systems. But I think we are progressing. The question is that everything needs to progress, right? So it's I like this transition theory, by the way, because I think it models this kind of change process very well. Not just because of the idea of innovations supplanting a kind of previous regime, but also because it considers the complexity of what keeps the current regime in place, which is not just about necessarily technology, but it has to do about and not just about necessarily the politics of left or right. It has to do with the habits that are embedded, the culture. It has to do with the mechanisms that we have in the society, the current institutions, even the sheer inertia of the built environment. I mean, right, let's have sustainable transport tomorrow, but you know, there's a lot of things that need to be deconstructed and rebuilt. I mean, we're talking, the appraisal for HS2 is 60 years. Some aspects were extended to 120 years. I mean, these are long time spans, right? So, I mean, I think things are changing. Things are getting there. Some countries are doing better than others.
Is that because they're getting better tools? Is that?
Well, I think it's part of it. I mean, that's the. So now I think that we're lacking tools that really take seriously what Brundtland said 30 years ago, that we should consider future generations. Okay, but if we have that, that's not going to be enough, because probably we need all the other stuff to come along with it. But I don't think that necessarily we're just going to do the wrong thing. I think we're just slowly kind of putting all this into place.
Yeah, because it's. I mean, some of these projects, decisions to be taken are extremely complex, and that's also what you're saying. And when we shouldn't remove the complexity, it's also what you're saying. So it's in some way fascinating, but it does mean that the tools we have to have also needs to be really, I mean, sophisticated to handle it.
Yeah, and there's a risk there, because that's also this black box effect. I think it was Otto this morning saying, and I picked up on that because he said the policymakers, they see it if you don't have enough data and if you don't trust your results, but they also like something to be simple. Right? I mean, first I was attracted by the simplicity of multi-criteria analysis, but after playing with only 33 respondents, and I mean, and then having some sensitivity analysis and checking the robustness, I mean, it's still quite something. It's good that there's software behind it that can help it, but then don't we risk, if it gets too complex, that we risk having this black box effect? I mean, I don't know what the solution is really, but I still think that the future generations' perspective is really something that we can, I think, relate to, right? As something, I mean, for some reason we don't. I would claim that we don't do it enough. It's kind of strange, right? Because we relate easily to 2,000 years ago, or even Descartes 400 years ago. That doesn't seem so far away. I mean, we're still influenced by Cartesian way of dividing nature and humans, but we don't really often think of 400 years ago. Actually, planning beyond 2050. That seems really far, right? I mean, but shouldn't it be fair that we're concerned about 2,000 years from now? I mean, there's no reason why there shouldn't be any humans 2,000 years from now, if we were not destroying the very premise for humans to be here in the first place. I don't know how to basically increase this sensitivity to future generations. I mean, it's like, but I think we're getting there. It's not a hopeless fight. I mean, we used to not care about Chinese factories and how people were treated or paid or whatever, and now there are more and more mechanisms to do that. So we just need the same, but not in space, but in time, in a way. So I'm surprisingly optimistic. It must be the good weather. I don't know.
Okay, no, that's fine. Okay, I would like to continue on the idea of that future generation. And indeed, already this morning I said maybe you can really have it as an extra stakeholder. Here what you do is just use those weights, the rod weights, to express a little bit more concern on the environment. And what I also liked the idea of the nested model for sustainability, where you say, well, first it should be okay for the environment, then social, and then only economical. But if you look at how it translates into the multi-criteria analysis model of the sustain framework, you say, well, there you can use Rembrandt, but that's just a normal way of working, and then I would use Smarter to have it for the nested model. However, it still are those different criteria, and you just give a little bit more weight. In fact, you should have like a veto voice or a restriction. Only if you have this type of score, you can go to the next level.
Yeah.
And I don't see that this happening with the Smarter method. There are many, many multi-criteria analysis methods, and maybe in Electra that would be possible, but at this, in the way you use it, it's not really going completely into that nested philosophy, I think.
Correct, yeah. That annoys me as well. Just to say a few more things about that is, well, and I think in paper 2 I say that actually it's a really rough approximation, that perspective, right? It doesn't, just like you say, it doesn't consider, I mean, the concept of planetary boundaries says that we have certain thresholds beyond which the impact is no longer linear, and beyond which there could be some kind of collapse, and we don't want to go there. Unfortunately, this does not take care of that. It would still just give a higher weight, but it doesn't mean that the impact cannot be traded. If the other benefits are high enough, we would still do it in that sense. So you're right, there's no threshold, and that I think is a problem. I have not worked with Electra. I have the documentation. I think it would be probably very relevant, especially for this, and especially for biodiversity and climate, to have it there. At the same time, that creates more of this black box effect, right? So what is the purpose here is again, is not to come with the exact final perfect answer. The idea is to try to, from a theoretical perspective that we can claim somewhat valid, represent one way of giving a future generation's perspective. So again, it's a little bit like the CBA. We need to keep in mind exactly these things. What does it include, what not? I mean, another problem with that is that I mean, not all environmental impacts are the same. I mean, it's not fair to just put them together. Noise is very short term. It's very
you said short term, and it's not really something for the future generation. But if you would put a airport near Copenhagen, very nearby, that future generation will also have an effect out of that. Yeah. So it's it's a tricky one, that noise. At this very moment, they are not hearing it, but they will have the noise afterwards anyway. Yeah. So also for that future generation, I think we really have to think about what are the criteria that are important for them, and even noise will, for certain projects, will have an impact.
Yeah. Two more things I'm thinking about this. The first is that it's not so that we have to do it this way and group. If we want to do theoretically, we can group the impacts by dimension and give those weights. But we could also not group them by dimension. And in the third article, I actually don't do that. I just do that as a reference to show, also to compare. But I keep them on a flat level, and we could use rod weights across these instead, which would be probably more finely grained. But the other thing to say is that this is the kind of top-down theoretical way of doing it, which is again just a kind of benchmark, a kind of perspective that we can use, knowing that it's created, it's virtual. But the way that I personally really think is promising is this idea of asking sustainable transport experts, and then they would then judge what is the importance of the criteria for a specific project, and in that sense, in the paper 3, the two sort of agree together, which in a way I would expect. But in a way, I would trust better the judgment of a group of people in that sense. But the problem with that is how
Yeah, and
you know,
there you had a problem of that selection.
yeah.
And in the end, for environmental criteria, you only keep 4 criteria
Yeah.
out of the whole list,
Yeah,
which is also, yeah, then reducing the insights.
correct.
So, yeah.
Yeah, but there was one aspect here that we took some, and we were very careful in how to group the different stakeholders and what actually defines then somebody who could take a sustainable transport researcher hat. And this part is maybe interesting to try to develop further, or maybe systematize. I mean, what we based it on is if the person has formal environmental studies, research background, or if they have actual experience on society level assessment. But it took a lot. I mean, what qualifies a sustainable transport research expert?
Yeah. We
It-
often say an expert is someone who's living 100 kilometers away. And that's why we fly you.
But I mean, actually a good point is that in paper 2 we involved Conchito, a green tank consultancy that Henrik is working for, I mean, yes. Well, why shouldn't they be then considered sustainability experts?
Yeah.
They should have something to say about that, obviously. So
I'm sure, but the terms experts, well, if they are an expert, they can do an evaluation. If they are a stakeholder, they have a stake, and so you have to be careful. And it's very interesting to see that indeed that person who was very motivated towards one of the alternatives, yeah, you can't trust his evaluation, and that's what I mean. If you have experts and they're really expert in environmental issues, okay, they can give their opinion about which option will be better on a certain criterion. But if you want to know, yeah, who finds what important, you really have to ask the stakeholders, and that's also transparent, because then it's like, yes, we have a stake, but these are the reasons why, and then things are coming on the table.
yeah.
So
So you're saying that the assessment process here is, from your perspective, a little bit shaky in a way, because everyone was involved and everything was merged. And to me, I thought it was a kind of strength, but
it's good that you say it yourself. No, but it's certainly interesting. But I think that part on what is a stakeholder and what is an expert, I think it's best to clarify. And I also understand from this part you still will be publishing papers. So I think it's important to really clearly say what is what and how it can bias the results.
yeah.
Okay.
And yes, these I still need to publish that. So actually, that's very useful.
Okay, I'm going to pick up a little bit on the HS2 case study, and I'll say for everyone listening in the room, I think it's a really interesting and challenging choice of a project to study. So I like the ambition of picking HS2. At £50 billion, it's the biggest transport investment that I think will happen in the UK in my lifetime, and I don't actually know what I think about it. I mean, if the question was, is this the best way to spend £50 billion in advancing sustainable transportation, the answer would be no. If it's, should we spend £50 billion on high-speed rail or see that money disappear, who knows where, then probably I'm supporting it. So it's a really
It
it's
depends.
a fascinating.
If it's in your backyard, you might
Well,
really
yeah, maybe I'm an expert because I'm far enough away from the track to not be directly affected by it. But I'm going to ask you about it in terms of this issue which I raised this morning about looking at projects rather than programs or whole area things. So, and in particular, I'll use CO2 as the route in, because in paper 4 you look at CO2 versus biodiversity effects. So, should all projects be sustainable in their own terms, or should we take a bigger perspective? And if we look at this particular example, rail is 2% of our surface transport emissions, and high-speed rail is, as you say, projected to be over the 60-year period carbon neutral, but in any case very small in terms of whether we actually meet our carbon reduction obligations. So HS2 is not a solution and never has been to carbon reduction, and probably would be in the noise of what's happening. So from a kind of trade-off point of view, where people are looking at the significance of different indicators, how do you deal with a project which has a value versus the bigger system that you're setting?
Yeah, that's the tough question, huh? Well, the first answer is I agree that in principle sustainability is about everything, the whole planet, for let's say 2000 next years at least. So it is. I mean, it's difficult to reduce it. Now, maybe at the national scale, obviously what would seem to be missing is a general strategy for how does all of this fit together towards a vision of sustainable transport, where clearly we can say that one single project is, as part of a package of other measures, a kind of part of that package that would have some synergy and that would have its purpose, right? That would probably be the ideal. So I would, but it's a bit unfair to say, yeah, but then we need to have this kind of top-down strategic planning. I mean, I'm tempted to say that, and that's also the idea with these SEAs, strategic environmental assessment. The point is that they're strategic, and by strategic it means that we have a future vision that we want to get to, and the decisions we make and those projects we decide to build should be stepping stones somehow to that vision. Now, if we don't have a vision and we don't have those goals and we don't have this overall strategy, it's a bit more difficult. But in a way, it justifies then that we have tools that can assess individual projects towards still a vision of sustainability, if we can define that based on the science. So the key point, I thought, was to try to be comprehensive in the impacts that are considered. And I think our list of impact is quite comprehensive, because we haven't discussed that, but we spent really a long time reviewing them. So in that sense, everything is kind of considered at the project level, but yeah, I mean, the thing is, these are not absolute measures. They're still relative measures, right? And you're also right that we don't have this fourth alternative, which is do nothing or do minimum. We could add that. I'm not really sure what to say. I think
I guess one of the things so this has been a thought forming as we've had the discussion, you've made your presentation, is where the where the understanding of the significance of the impact is. So it might say 14,000 tons of carbon, and somebody may look at that versus a journey time saving of 5 minutes.
Yeah.
How do they know how significant 14,000 tons of carbon is in the much bigger scale of things when they're making assessments? I mean, maybe for experts that becomes less problematic, although actually I'm not, for the reasons we've discussed earlier, not 100% convinced.
That's a very good point. This issue of relevance and importance, and I've seen it. But actually, people were quite smart in answering this. I'm not sure if I can really recall the actual example, but it was something about. I think it was either carbon or biodiversity, but he would say and it was one of these sustainable transport experts, and he said normally I would rank carbon or biodiversity really high in the grand scheme of things, but because of what we're talking here, which is basically 3 options of rail, it's not as important in this case. So he actually weighted he actually weighed that impact less than journey time in that sense, because he thought that was more important, even though the understanding was truly there. So I thought that was pretty smart, but that was the good way of understanding how this should be done. Some really wanted that separated. So we're talking here of, so we have this kind of importance, and then we have this assessment, right? But in importance, we have the contextual relevance of the impact from a kind of global perspective, and then the importance from a personal stakeholder perspective, and then the actual assessment. And I think this could perhaps be divided, but most people were quite comfortable with answering both aspects kind of holistically. But I mean, economists, actually people that the people I had more trouble with was at the Department for Transport, because they were very careful to not take a judgment. They didn't want to take a judgment. They would only basically answer, because taking judgments, that's for politicians. They would only answer the parts that had to do with the actual assessment. And in that sense, they were interested to really only rate how significant, or as you say, or how contextually relevant that impact was in this case, and then how they performed, how each alternative performed. But they would not answer how important that was to them, because that to them was basically just check the goals of HS2, and this is how important they are. That's it. And I thought that was really interesting. I don't make a big case of it in the paper, but it is something that has been sort of there all along, is whether we should divide this contextual relevance with personal preference.
And it is complicated because some things are just important in their own right for that project, and some things have an importance in a bigger picture. So there may be, 100 areas of woodland that are like that in a country, and so making a decision on one piece of woodland is maybe difficult different to something else about what local stakeholders are looking for in terms of quality of life of their neighbourhood or something. So
that's your point about the boundaries.
So in looking at what you've done, it's and the framework which you set out on sustainability assessment is making me think lots of interesting new things, which you haven't resolved, but again, I think you may be able to develop some of those arguments further, or at least use some of the qualitative evidence that you have to support that. But just one final question on that, the strategic environmental assessment, I think this kind of notion that wouldn't it be great if we had an integrated transport strategy? Again, there's the kind of question of complexity and simplicity. So with HS2, they looked at over 200 different initial alignment combinations. So they looked at an enormous number before they came down to what they looked at. If you do a strategic assessment with corridors with lots of different schemes on them, just the number of combinations of different things which you could look at, the number of outputs, it becomes, and the significance of the outcomes of one scheme versus all the other schemes become much more complicated. So having gone to the project level, what's your kind of reflection about the challenges of kind of aggregating up to this bigger picture that we might imagine that we'd like to have?
Well, I mean, in theory, these tools can be put in a hierarchy, right? It's actually called analytical hierarchy process. I mean, it gets more complicated, but in theory, it's possible to do it. Which is a good point also on the alignments, because I read through it's the appraisal of sustainability that actually settled the alignment, and they used this comparative approach for little segments along the way. So they have used exactly this approach for deciding on the actual final alignment, which I thought, I mean, it's just a one line somewhere, but it's interesting that they have applied that method for it to deal out of this complexity. So is it scalable? I mean, I would guess why not, huh? It's just if we take the European level, yeah, even.
Well, I guess it's a question of thinking through maybe what you gain at different levels of decision making and what you lose from that, and maybe who you can engage in what at different levels. Yeah. And I think maybe you've got some opportunity to do at least some thinking about what's missing from just operating at that scale that frustrated you.
Yeah, and that reminds me now of one of the conclusion about the value of applying this approach is that it sort of forces the explicit evaluation of alternatives early on. I mean, you cannot have a multi-criteria analysis without having real options there. While if we look at how HS2 was done, it was really about let's do HS2, and then maybe now we need to find out, because EIA says that we should consider options, so let's see what these other options perform, but we still need to do HS2. And then let's look at the environmental impacts, and still we're going to do HS2. So actually, if you look at the appraisal of sustainability, how HS2 is there, and the final HS2, it hasn't actually changed very much. Now, could the value here at any scale would really be to genuinely offer this idea of, okay, so are we doing this or doing that, and that. But it could still be framed, because you could still say, well, the problem actually in this approach is that at the beginning of the questionnaire we say, okay, so the official objectives of HS2 are connecting the north and the south and capacity and all of that, but we only state those. I mean, you don't need to necessarily accept that, but if we look at there is this tension about what are the goals, what is the overall boundary. Now I'm talking about all things at the same time.
That's why it's such an ambitious case study, because the goals kept shifting as they hit. So,
but there was a good example anyway, just to make it more concrete, on the, what is it called, the NIF, the new NEF, New Economic Frontier or something, Foundation, New Economic Foundation. They came up with alternatives to, and we're quite conservative in the alternatives that we have here, right? They're basically just phase one alternate rail options, but they suggested, well, we could instead invest in high-speed broadband instead of high-speed rail, which also makes sense from a sustainability perspective. Or we could invest instead in cities, because what we want is much more connectivity inside cities, and yeah, okay, so what was I saying? I think that that basically that MCA, these tools can open up the debate earlier, involve more options, and perhaps, I guess it needs to be proven, but perhaps show that there are alternatives, because basically we're opening up the discussion. The example from Otto this morning was really telling, because they had this congestion committee, and he said we had 105 things that we never thought of before. I mean, in a way, it shows that opening up to stakeholder involvement earlier in a more systematic way that MCA allows could open up for these wider options that we haven't thought about. But it still depends on how it's framed and whether we allow it to be opened up, basically. Because if it's framed in a way that we need to improve capacity between Birmingham and London, you're probably going to build something as an outcome, no matter what. So.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't think so. We've saved the last question for the fifth paper, or we.
Depends how.
Depends.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about reasonable travel time?
Well, I'd love to talk about reasonable travel time.
Yeah. Okay. Let's keep this fairly brief and light. So there was an introduction by Yannick to the final paper on reasonable travel time, which I think is really important because of the ways in which the meaning of travel time has changed and is changing and will change over the next 10, 20 plus years in quite fundamental ways. And given the importance of travel time savings in traditional cost-benefit approaches, it was really great. We all really enjoyed seeing that in there. And it's quite a provocative article. I think it's worth reading and engaging with for everyone here. I guess, so one of the queries I would have though is, hasn't travel time been changing over the past decades? And do we not capture that in what we ask people about their travel anyway? So if 20 years ago we'd asked somebody about the trade-off between journey time and journey experience, we'd have got a different answer to the one we get today, which will be different to the one we get in 20 years. Do we need a new concept, or do our existing tools not already capture these trade-offs?
Yeah. I mean, one way to look at it, which would be very humble, is just to say that we're not inventing anything here. I mean, these are things that are already somewhat there. Okay, it's not that we don't know. If you interview somebody traveling somewhere, that they would be concerned about how long it takes them to walk to the bus stop, let's say. In fact, we know that there's probably some kind of distance, ideal distance to the catchment area of a bus stop, 500 meters, 1 kilometer, whatever it is in models, I don't know.
But we also have self-driving cars in a few years.
Yeah. But I think all these, and then the issue of use of the experience of travel is also quite well developed in the literature. There's quite a bit on that. So I think this is it's a way to perhaps. I don't think the ambition is really high, but the ambition is still to repackage. Not repackage, to package, to sort of make sense of these different aspects that are important to travel time, and to frame them in a way that could be useful or used to actually make change. Because the other problem is that the planning approach is still by far based on travel time savings, and that's fair enough. I think it's genuine that we want to save time. Time is limited, obviously, for everyone. And it's also genuine. I think we have a genuine need for pretty much being anywhere at any time. So in theory, there's no reason why I would not want to have dinner in Beijing tonight. So in that sense, I don't think we've seen the end of transport and investment in reducing travel time. But the key starting point was really that we've probably gone too far in one aspect of it, which is pretty much speed at any cost, you could say, especially at any environmental cost, and that instead we could look at investing our effort in better ways. The case of the UK is in high-speed rail is quite interesting there, because I think it was in the, was it Eddington report? Eddington that concluded that in the context of compact geography of the UK and with the, he judged, fairly poor overall connectivity, that it would be much better to invest 50 billion in improving the current system than building any kind of new line. This is the kind of thing that this concept supports. So it's just an attempt, let's say, to propose a mindset to look at transport in a way that, okay, so obviously we still want to reach more places, and that's fair enough in our 70-minute budget per day of average that we're going to travel anyway. How far can we go? But you know, can we look at the other aspects of it? I mean, is that the only solution? And that's the idea, is that we can look at then improving, of course, the speed, but we could improve the experience, or we could improve the connectivity and the experience on the connectivity, and in the end we would still gain the same time. So it's not really discrediting any of the previous approaches, just opening up to more possibilities.
And I think it's a really good idea indeed. And if you look at how your Ph.D. has been built up, you started with an indicator framework and also saying, I want to make it more concrete, how to utilize it. With this concept, which in the paper you say quite high level, how would you use that in an appraisal method? How can you make it concrete? What kind of indicator would you use for it?
Well, there's some simple ones actually. Yeah, how to measure it, that's the big question we keep being asked, in fact, on this one. It's like, if it's not measurable, it doesn't count. We can't do anything about it.
No, but indeed you try to open it up. So.
Yeah, no, that's okay. No, that's okay. No, but basically well, there's some starting points. I mean, if we look at the destination characteristics, we can look at the ratio of time spent at destination over the ratio of travel time, for example. I mean, of course, these are all traveler characteristics, so in practice operationalizing all that is quite complex. I'm really not necessarily the expert, but I mean, the travel surveys that they're doing are getting more and more into this kind of behavioral statistics or whatever it is. But the one I like a lot is this door-to-door approach. I mean, it's quite easy to calculate. We have big data now. I mean, we could, in theory, calculate everything for everyone, for all their trips, and getting an idea of how much time they spend in access, in egress, in weight, and then also get a kind of, you know, a Hansher type productivity ratio for the experience while they travel through each of these legs. And I mean, in theory, everything could sort of be measured. Yeah. And given a.
Last name is Google.
What's that?
If your last name is Google.
If your last name is Google, exactly. Yeah. Now, how would that then influence in decision support? I mean, we could. I mean, I'm not sure. Huh? I mean, on one hand, we could set. It could be, yeah, it could be policy based. We could set some thresholds on this kind of wasted time over non-wasted time. I don't know. I'm not sure actually how to use that.
I think it offers opportunities to think about the well-being of travellers rather than just the functional characteristics, the productivity and utility of travel.
Well,
so I think in a sense,
yeah.
in a sustainability agenda, I think it offers a new way of connecting the user to daily life. So I think it does have a lot to offer it, and I probably think Google will measure it before we work out what should go in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. But it is a traveler's perspective, in that sense. What's the other point I wanted to say perhaps on this is, yeah, well, the key is to think of transport systems. Basically, the time spent on transport system. I mean, how much of it is taken by the transport system itself while I'm traveling? How much of the time that I'm using while traveling is stolen from me because it requires my cognitive or my physical effort? I mean, the point is that the transport system could think of reducing these efforts, and in that way I could reclaim the time that I use while traveling to put it to any kind of use. And here I'm not saying it needs to be necessarily working, because for most of knowledge economy, I don't know if there's a difference of value between the time that I rest or the time that I work. It's not really clear. I don't think there's really a boundary. The point is that the time is then mine, which means that if this 70 minutes a day holds, I could even travel further and therefore access more opportunities and therefore be more happy. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a complicated question, because it also depends on the time that you are traveling. For example, if I'm traveling in the morning, I might be reading papers during my travel, while in the evening, well, I might be too tired. So already, what's the value, or the value in the sense of productivity? It will also depend on the time of the day, not only on the travel time.
Yeah.
Also.
But
it's a very interesting concept that you brought in.
But on this, I sort of made an opinion, and I'm not sure if it's right because we didn't write it in the paper because it was maybe too esoteric. But I thought that actually there's no difference in value, because at the end of the day, I have this amount of hours in 1 year, and I decide how I use them. And who's to judge whether I'm productive or not? I mean, whether I decide to sleep or whether I decide to work or whether I decide to rest. I mean, at some point or another, I'm going to do all these activities. So the key point is whether I'm wasting my time, whether it's taken away from me, or whether I can use it for something which I deem relevant, basically.
Yeah, but not everyone can sleep in a train.
No, of course, no. And that's where the experience quality matters, but I'm not sure if we should have beds in every transport. I don't know.
I think we will finish here.
Yeah.
So thank you, Yannick. So we finished here.
Yeah. So now I will ask Henrik as a supervisor if he has some questions.
No, I'm perfectly happy.
Okay, then finally we have a question from the audience by Georgi Katos. Maybe it's...
Yannick, thank you for your work on this difficult subject, especially the conceptualization. My question has to do with a notion that comes up all day today, early in the morning, and not only from you. And that has to do with the interests of the future generations. Now, if you were to apply this MAMCA technique, whom would you invite to represent the future generations, first of all? Secondly, whoever this person is, who has given him this mandate to represent future generations? And the third is that, given that this will be a real person living now, then how will he be able to express the wishes of the future generation in an environment of disruptive change in transport that we see? I mean, even in 20, 30 years' time, we cannot even imagine how the transport system will look like. How then will we be able to express the wishes of this generation?
Yeah. Well, obviously, it's not possible to ask them directly. Huh? That's a bit sad. That would be the best way. So we have no choice to simulate it. Okay. So your question of who then to ask specifically. I think, well, there's a few answers to that. First, I think isn't it in the EU that we have, or somewhere, it's been created this kind of sustainability ombudsman, like a real, somebody who represents the interest of future generations in decision making at EU level. I can't recall what I read about this, but it's somebody that you can complain to, let's say, if something is done against their interest. I mean, I think that we could have an official, let's say, in institution that would, or a group, a team of officials that would represent that interest and would do basically the work that I've started doing here, trying to think it through, right? That think it through could be done based on science or whatever way. Now, another way to answer it is I really like this Rawls' theory of justice to answer this, because in fact you could also just ask anybody. Okay, if I ask you, and this veil of ignorance approach, which is basically this idea of what is fair. Okay, if I'm to decide what is the more fair, I can ask someone, now you don't know who you are, you don't know where you are, you could be a young person, an old person, living in China or living in the UK. Now, given this problem, and knowing that you could be any of these people, which solution or which preference would you have? And obviously, because you could be, theoretically, you could be in the shoes of the worse off person in any kind of deal. You would be probably very careful in taking a decision that would have impacts to those that would be treated unfairly as a result of taking that decision, right? And that's Rawls' theory of justice, and the idea is just to extend that concept to future generations and to say, well, I mean, I'm asking you to take a decision on this or take a stand on this, but you don't know if you're alive today or if you're alive in 10 years or if you're alive in 100 years or 2,000 years from now. So you have to take that into consideration when you answer whether we should do this or not. I think this, I don't know, I haven't tested, but I think this kind of exercise can work quite well. The problem is that still that we're willing to do this, we do need to make some kind of assumptions on how the future will be, and that's of course difficult to predict. But again, it depends maybe on the like I introduced at the very beginning of the presentation. What kind of visions of the future do we have? And that's where perhaps there could be differences in the answers. If we have a vision of a living planet where humans are living as part of nature and ecological system are still working, or whether we have a vision of perhaps a dead planet, but you know, technologically managed by humans, where everything that we need is there anyway, and that's possibly air cooled by some kind of geo system. I mean, you know, maybe future generations wouldn't know any better anyway. So it's very complicated. I'm sure there's philosophers thinking of how to resolve the problem of agency or non-agency of future generations. Because if you think about it, if we decide to destroy everything, future generations will not be there to care. So they have zero agency. So it's yeah, it's a really tough one, huh? But does that answer it somehow? I mean, I think officially we can create something. I mean, it's better than doing nothing, and have people think about it based on principles. And then I would suggest Rawls' principle as a kind of a starting point, at least.
Okay.
Can I just add one comment to that? Yeah. Actually, it's closer to home than you think. We don't have such an institution in the EU, but one of your home countries, Canada, is where they invented this commissioner for the future generations, which is an institutions with building and houses and expertise available to actually try to accomplish this over. So if you had more time, you probably could have studied that case as well.
Okay. Well, that's useful because I also need a job. So.
Yeah. I think the position is vacant right now.
Okay. So I think this is finishing the Ph.D. defense. Okay. And what will happen now is that we will leave the room here and see if we can find some reception outside here. And the committee would have a short meeting and discuss what they think about the defense and the Ph.D. and come out and join us and inform us about the thesis.
Thank you.
Okay.